Okay, it is August 12, 2017, and this is a continuation of the community rule studies. So let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you very much for all the blessings that you give us, those that we actually know about and also those that we don't, because we're sure that you're doing a lot for us of which we're not even aware, since it so happens that from time to time we come to learn what you've been doing for us for a period of time and we didn't know it. So thank you so much for all of that. And thank you for the principles that you've been teaching us, even though we know that we've been slow to learn. But please help us to incorporate these principles into our investigation of truth. Help us to understand exactly what the message is that you have for us. Help us to be able to declare it to others, not only in word, but in deed and in love. Help us to incorporate these principles into our lives. Thank you so much. We ask this b'Shem Tzemach. Amen.
Amen.
And the translation, for those who don't know, b'Shem Tzemach means in the name of branch, which is the name of Christ. So, last night we were studying the community rule and read 3 different copies of the same section of the community rule, and we want to get back into that tonight and really try to get more into the content of it. But before that, I'll give a summary of what the community rule is and so on and so forth, as we have been doing. And then we hope to read these different versions of this same material, but read it little bit by little bit and compare them and try to take note of the differences, because we want to judge it rightly. So, again, before getting into that, the community rule is a document that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it primarily describes the beliefs and practices of a Jewish sect which had its beginning in the first part of the 2nd century BCE and lasted up until the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. And there are many reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls are important and why the community rule in particular is important. But one of the reasons is that it tells us a lot of background information for understanding Jesus and the movement that followed him, even to the point that if you view the Jesus movement as part of a lineage of movements going back in time, the community rule represents a movement and a message which was a predecessor to the Jesus movement. So the Jesus movement was not coming in direct lineage from the Sadducees or from the Pharisees, but it is fair to say that they were coming in direct lineage from the movement portrayed or represented in and by the community rule. That's not to say that everyone in the days of Jesus who viewed themselves as coming from the community represented in the community rule was a predecessor of Jesus. It's saying that the movement 200 years before Jesus is something which he aligned himself with. So it's like this. It is really helpful to think of it in terms of lineage and a family tree and that sort of thing. And so there's a group of Jews called the Essenes. They were a sect of Judaism in the days of Jesus and before. And ancient and modern historians talk about the Essenes, and it's clear that Jesus agreed with the Essenes in his day on some things, but disagreed with them on other things. And so Jesus would not have been considered by other Essenes to necessarily have been an Essene, or if he was on the fringe, or not really. He really had some major differences with what likely most Essenes in his day were saying. So he wasn't equivalent with the Essene movement of his day, but they both traced themselves back to a common starting point. So, like Jesus and others of his day who may have called themselves Essenes, they were kind of like cousins in terms of lineage, or maybe siblings, but not descended from one another. They both go back to this core movement in the 2nd century BC, which is represented in the community rule. That movement was the one that was founded by the teacher of righteousness. And so the Essenes of Jesus' day certainly considered the teacher of righteousness to be a true prophet, but Jesus and his followers also considered the teacher of righteousness to be a true prophet. So, since the community rule definitely contains some of the teachings of the teacher of righteousness, it is very important for us to investigate. It may be that he actually wrote the community rule, but perhaps not. We have not yet been able to determine who wrote the community rule, or whether it was written by multiple individuals, and different questions along those lines. But we are in the process of investigating those questions, and whatever the case may be, it is certainly an important text because of its connection to Jesus and James and Paul and the others, but also for other reasons, which we won't go all into now, and we've talked about it in many different conference calls already. So we've been studying the community rule. We're trying to find out what it has to say for itself. We don't want to misinterpret it and judge it according to our misinterpretation of what it has to say. We really want to understand what it has to say for itself. And then we want to compare its unique and original claims to material reality to see whether it corresponds. If it corresponds, by definition, those claims are true. If the claims do not correspond, by definition, they are false. So we are endeavoring to go into this without our preconceived ideas. Rather, we want to find out what it says, investigate whether it's true, and go with the truth, whatever it may be. Now, in the past several studies, we have had to address different issues in regard to the community rule from what we have had to do for the first 90 or so studies that we've had on the subject. And in particular, we are needing to compare the manuscripts of the community rule in order to discern the history of the transmission and the composition of the text. So the community rule is only known to us from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 12 copies of the community rule were found, although one is kind of debated as to whether it's the community rule or a quotation of the community rule in another document, so perhaps it's better to say 11 or 12 copies. Either way, we have several copies. They're not all perfectly preserved. The best preserved one is referred to as 1QS, because it was found in Cave 1, and the S stands for Serek Ha-Yahad, which is the Hebrew for the rule of the community, or the community rule. That copy is very well preserved, and it, along with all the other copies, was not written in a book form or in a codex form. As a side note, a codex is an ancient form or predecessor of a book. It was leaflets bound together on one side that you could flip through. Rather, all of the copies of the community rule were written on scrolls. And so rather than there being pages, there were columns. 1QS has 11 columns. Thus far, we have studied the first 4 of those 11 columns, and we are now getting into column 5. There are 2 other scrolls from Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain fragmentary copies of that part of the community rule, which is the same as 1QS column 5. So just to make sure everyone is following what I'm saying, and perhaps all of you here live on the call are, because we've gone through this several times. When it comes to this particular section of the community rule, the one which we can refer to as 1QS column 5, lines 1 to 20, we have this copy, 1QS, as a witness to that content. And then we also have 2 other scrolls which have that same content, though it's not exactly the same. There's 4QS manuscript B, B as in boy, and 4QS manuscript D, D as in David. Both of those scrolls are not entirely preserved. We only have fragments of them. But what we have of them does parallel this section from 1QS column 5. And it's not to say that that's all that those scrolls preserve. They do preserve more. But it preserves this portion. So rather than taking all of the bits and pieces of the community rule from all of the copies and putting them on the table and trying to sort it all out all at once, we're taking a smaller bite-sized portion and comparing these 3 texts. The 2 from Cave 4 are very similar one to another. And the copy from Cave 1, 1QS, stands out as different from those other 2. The 1QS scroll was copied or written in about the year 100 BCE, and maybe even a bit earlier. So it goes back into the 2nd century BCE. The other 2 manuscripts that we're looking at, 4QSB and 4QSD, were copied in the latter portion of the 1st century before the Common Era, between the years 30 and 1, which means that they come from anywhere between 70 to 100 years and potentially even a little bit more after 1QS. One of the questions to ask is, does that mean that the Cave 4 readings, the actual wording of the text in the Cave 4 documents, the fact that the manuscripts themselves come from a later time, does that mean that they represent a later form of the text? In other words, 1QS is more original, and then scribes later changed it to the Cave 4 readings. That's one possibility for us to consider. Another possibility is that even though the Cave 4 documents were written later, they actually represent an earlier reading. And perhaps the scribe who made 1QS changed some things, and then later scribes said, no, that's not really the original wording. Let's copy an older thing. So perhaps the Cave 4 manuscripts, they themselves are copies. Perhaps they weren't copying something from 100 BCE. Maybe they were copying something from even earlier, like 150 BCE. Maybe they were a copy of the actual original community rule. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying these are possibilities for us to consider, and we have to look at the evidence. And so the way that we have to do that is to compare the Cave 1 copy with the Cave 4 copies. So we're just starting with this stuff from column 5 of 1QS, and then we will move forward into other sections in the latter part of column 5 and then going into column 6. But we're just going to deal with these 3 manuscripts for now. So this time, rather than me asking if you guys have comments or questions broadly on the community rule, we want to try and keep focused on going through column 5. So let's not get into the other elements of the community rule and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nazarenes and how they were influenced by the community rule and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We do that often where we'll ask broad questions like that, and we can do that again in another meeting. But for now, I just want to ask if anyone has comments or questions on what we're doing right now and the things that I just said. Is it all clear to everyone? And are you guys ready to dive into this comparison between these 3 manuscripts?
Yes. And I did have, when we get to line 2, I have a question. So we may not even get to it tonight. I don't know.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so that won't take us long to get into that. So let's start with this comparison then. So for those of you who have Geza Vermesh's translation, you have 1QS translated, and then right after a translation of 1QS, there's a translation of 4QS manuscript D, D as in David. And again, that's very similar to manuscript B, but there may be some differences. So what I was kind of thinking to do is you guys can follow along with whichever copy you want. If you want to follow on in 1QS, that's fine. If you want to follow along in 4QSD, that's fine too. And if you have another translation that gives you 4QS manuscript B, B as in boy, that's fine for you to follow along with that too. You follow along with whichever one you want. But it would be nice perhaps if someone reads along with 1QS. And since 1QS is the best preserved copy, we'll use that as our base text to work from. And all I mean by that is we'll read a line of what it has to say first. And when I say a line, perhaps I shouldn't even say a line because I'm not meaning necessarily a line of 1QS. So 1QS, column 5, line 1, and then stop at the end of line 1. We'll maybe read a phrase or a small little sentence or so, and then compare with the other manuscripts to see if they're the same or if they are different. So I'm getting my fingers in all of the various places. And I may ask you guys, like, hey, do you see a difference in any of the manuscripts?
The only thing I have is the 1QS, so the others are obtainable online, I guess. And if you told us how to get them, I didn't write it down, so I'll do that maybe later and look at them. But so all I can do is look at the one I have tonight.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. 1QS is the best preserved anyway, so it'll be totally fine to follow along with that. And you know what I might do? Just because if we do use 1QS as our base text, it may have some sort of psychological effect to cause us to favor 1QS. So instead, rather than always following one manuscript as the one that we read first, we may mix it up a bit and say, oh, let's look at this first little part from 4QS manuscript B and then 4QS manuscript D. And let me actually ask you guys first before we go further into this. When I say B, are you clear that I'm saying B as in boy? And when I say D, can you hear me clearly enough that you know that I'm saying D as in David? Or will it be more helpful for me to say something like 4QS manuscript boy, 4QS manuscript David? Or is just saying B and D fine? What do you guys think?
Well, it is really close. Whenever I'm speaking on the phone, and I'll do like you said, I'll say D boy, D David. That's the way I do it. But, it is pretty close. Sometimes it's hard to understand it, and sometimes it comes through. So whatever you think. I don't know about everybody else.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's just the safer way to go to say B boy, D David, so that it's always clear and there won't be confusion. Okay, so that said, I'll start with the first little phrase, as it is in 4QS manuscript B as in boy. So this is the very first part. Instructions for the master concerning, and then ... and it's actually missing in this fragment. However, it may be the same as what is in 4QS manuscript D, as in David, because the first part is the same. And I'll actually read that next. Instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast from all that he has commanded. Okay. Do you guys notice anything different between that and 1QS?
I didn't see anything significant unless I just missed it.
Okay, so you're following along with 1QS, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the sentence was arranged differently, but to me it meant basically the same thing.
Do you mind reading just that same part in 1QS?
Sure. And this is the rule for the men of the community who have freely pledged themselves to be converted from all evil and to cling to all his commandments according to his will.
Okay, so does anyone see any major differences between what I read and what Lynn just read?
And would you read the other one again? It will help me.
Sure, I'll read it again. Instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded.
Oh, okay, I see something. That one is saying instructions to the master, and the 1QS is saying this is the rule for the men of the community. Of course, I don't have the other one right in front of me, but that's what it sounded like to me. Instructions for the master on the one, and the rule for the men of the community on the one that I have.
Yeah, that's definitely an important difference. So both of the Cave 4 manuscripts say instructions for the master concerning, and again, manuscript B as in boy leaves out a bunch. It's instructions for the master concerning, and then it's ... In other words, the manuscript is damaged. You can't read that part, whether there's holes or whatever it may be. It's damaged for a while, and then it just says, which he has commanded. But if you compare that to the other Cave 4 manuscript, the other Cave 4 manuscript is not damaged in that part. It says, instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded.
Well, I have another question that mine, as I already said, it's the rule for the men of the community versus instructions for the master. And then mine, skipping along a little bit, says, and to cling to all his commandments according to his will. So if the very first part had said, this is the rule for the master, then the rest of it would have fit in better. I don't know if the right word is grammatically, but anyway, it doesn't match. Men of the community is plural. Is that referring to God when it says his commandments? That's what I thought when I was reading it. All his commandments, meaning Yeshua, according to his will. But now I'm wondering if it got mixed up and it's referring to the master. So I don't know. I just pointed that out.
That is seriously a very excellent observation. When you read it in 1QS, it's grammatically awkward, or perhaps better, grammatically lacking, in that it has the personal pronouns he and his without any clear subject. And so I'll read it again. This is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will. Well, there's no one that could be referred to as he within the sentence, as you pointed out very well, that saying men of the community, that's plural, so that he wouldn't seem to be referring to the men, and especially since it says that they devote themselves to turn away from evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded. The he seems to be someone other than they. They devote themselves. So it would be really awkward for it to be referring to them as he at this point. So that seems to be a problem. It doesn't flow properly. Whereas sorry, go ahead.
No, you finish what you're saying. I was getting excited about something else I saw here, but you go ahead and finish, Trent. I'm so sorry I interrupted.
Okay. Yeah, not a problem. So in the Cave 4 manuscripts, that problem is not there. It says, instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have devoted themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded. Okay, well, there you have a he being the master, and there's a they again, and it's the men of the law, the men of the Torah. And so that grammatically makes perfect sense. So that's quite interesting. That's pretty good. That's good to note. But just as we were being cut off, I was just mentioning another thing that I wanted to point out. In the 1QS manuscript, one might say, well, maybe it's God, all that he has commanded. But again, that would only be an implication, and we would have to interject that because it doesn't say that. God is not a word in the sentence or anything like that. But I was just pointing out also that when you said it, you said Yeshua, about the he being Yeshua, but of course that would be anachronistic. It's applying a later idea to an earlier time because Yeshua, Jesus, was not yet born, and whoever wrote this wasn't thinking of Jesus as the Messiah and things like that. I get what you mean, but I just wanted to mention that so we can keep the idea of anachronism in mind and all of that. But you said you had another observation that you were excited about?
Well, I don't know why I didn't mention this. It just didn't jump out at me till now. But we've got two plurals in the 1QS, the men of the community, and then who have freely pledged themselves. So there's plural, plural, and then singular, singular. And the one that is in the other one that you read seems to match. The whole thing seems to come together better. I don't know which one is right. Well, the one that you read sounds better to me, doesn't it? I mean, I'm going to let somebody else have a chance to say something about that. But yeah, men in themselves is plural, and then his and his. So I like the sounds of the one that you're reading better. And then when we do go on, it's going to mention a group of people. So that's plural.
Okay. So the question to ask ourselves then is, since there is a difference, and actually we can observe something about that difference, the fact that in one, it's more coherent, it flows more easily, whereas the other, it's a bit more awkwardly worded and so on. So the question is, and again, let's keep in mind that anything that we say right now, we are not drawing conclusions, because before drawing conclusions, we have to take in all the evidence. This is just the first difference between these manuscripts that we're looking at. So we're not going to, on the basis of just one difference, decide which manuscript is more original and which one is a later scribal change. We need to look at all of the differences and take everything into account. But we still do need to look at each one and say, what hypothesis best explains this change, even if it's just a hypothesis. It doesn't have to be a conclusion. We're not making final decisions. It's just, okay, what is likely? Would a scribe change the community rule if it originally read, "This is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will"? If that was the original, would a scribe change that to read instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded? Would a scribe change it from one to the other? And if so, why? Not that we're getting into the motives of a scribe who we don't even know who he is, but just saying, hypothetically, would there be a reason for changing it from one to another? Likewise, if it originally read instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded, would a scribe change it from that to, "This is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will"? Okay, so those are two options, changing from one to the other, from 1QS to how it is in the K4 manuscripts, or changing it from how it is in the K4 manuscripts to how it is in 1QS. So let's keep our critical thinking caps on. And does anyone have suggestions as to why changing it from one to the other may be more likely than vice versa? I just wanted to mention, since we are on the computer tonight and we just noticed someone call in, we are here. It's just, I just asked a question and people are contemplating it. And I'll actually ask the question again. So we have these different manuscripts of the community rule, and we're looking at a particular place that is represented in 3 manuscripts, 2 of them from Cave 4, 1 of them from Cave 1. And the question is, which direction does the change go? Was the original reading how it is in 1QS, and then it was later changed to how it is in the Cave 4 manuscripts? Or was it originally how it is in the Cave 4 manuscripts, and it was changed to how it is in 1QS? Again, in 1QS, it says, "This is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will." So you have the rule of the men of the community, a group of people, the men of the community, or the people of the community, because the word is, I'd have to look at the Hebrew, but it's most likely not gender specific. And so I can look that up while you guys are thinking of the answer. But we have the people of the community who devote themselves, and they're going to hold fast to all which he has commanded. But in 1QS, there is no person identified in the sentence as he, so it's a little bit awkward. It's grammatically imperfect. And then in the Cave 4 manuscripts, manuscript B as in boy and D as in David, and particularly D in this section because that's the one that we have without holes in the manuscript and other things that might make it unreadable. In this version, it says, "Instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded." So there's several differences between these manuscripts. In 1QS, it is rule or a rule for the men of the community. In Cave 4, it's instructions for the master. In Cave 1, the instructions are simply for those who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded, whoever he is. In Cave 4, it's instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and hold fast to all that he has commanded. The other difference is that in Cave 1, it's which he has commanded as his will, whereas in Cave 4, it's simply which he has commanded. So those are the differences between the readings in Cave 1 and in Cave 4. So does anyone have any thoughts as to which one may be the more original and so on?
I'm going to give it a shot, but yeah. It seems to me that the Cave 1, the 1QS, would be the original because the one in Cave, Cave 1QS would be the original, and the one in B, the Cave 4, would be secondary because if it you start off with a rule, right? And then it could have been added that it became an instruction for the master to now appoint this rule that was already an original rule. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So the idea is, in both of them, basically it is a rule or instructions that is basically it ends up relating to this group of people, whoever they are, whether you call them the men of the law or the men of the community. And so the thought is, well, perhaps it was already an instruction for them in some way, and then later it's, okay, well, it'll be turned into an instruction for the master, and it's already an already existing instruction, but now this is, rather than directing it to the people, it's directed to the master, who is to teach the people. So that's one thought. So let us, I want to say something about how we should go about this discussion, because often in discussions, when, like, if you go to like a regular Bible study, which, as I'm sure you guys can tell, is not this, when people say things, often people will find themselves inclined to agree with what other people say, and like, oh yeah, that's a good thought, even if they really disagree with it. And by the way, Anna, I'm not saying that I disagree with you, and I'm also not saying that I agree with you, but I am saying that if anyone disagrees with what Anna just said and thinks, maybe that's not actually the way it is, and that doesn't make sense for the following reasons, we shouldn't be afraid to say so, right? Because this is the way experimentation works. We are having an observation, and then we put forward hypotheses. And whether those hypotheses are right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's part of the process of investigating it. And of course, yes, we want to find the right hypotheses. But even if a hypothesis that is suggested is wrong, studying it and learning why it's wrong is part of the process of learning. We're canceling out possibilities. And so perhaps what Anna just said is actually a valid reason, and that actually 1QS is the original. But we won't know that unless we test it. So I don't think Anna will be offended if someone says, actually, no, I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that that's a right hypothesis, and here's why. And then someone could explain why they think it's not correct. So we have to put our own suggestions to the test. And even Anna, if you think, oh, you know what, I'm thinking that's not a good hypothesis, and here's why, that's fine. We can challenge our own hypothesis. We can challenge the hypotheses that others put forward. And we need to be able to do this without thinking like, oh, well, you don't like my opinion, you don't like my perspective. Let's not allow ourselves to become degraded into taking things personally and favoring our own ideas and being upset if someone disagrees and that sort of thing. This is all part of the principles and part of what we're trying to learn in this, that we need to be able to actually voice our disagreements. If someone puts forward a hypothesis on something like this, we need to voice the disagreements as part of the process of learning. Imagine if medical scientists were afraid to disagree with each other and were like, oh, I don't want to offend the other chemist or biologist, so I'm just going to, like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea, and move on. I mean, nothing would get done. Science wouldn't happen. And so if we are to be true experimentalists, we need to be able to go down that road of, you know what, I don't think that's right, and here's why. And we all need to learn to be happy if we are wrong, and happy if we're right, whatever it may be, but just we're doing this together. It's not about whose idea it was or anything like that. It's just we look at an idea, we consider a hypothesis on its own merits, and we test it. We put it to the test. We try to falsify it or try to verify it and see whether it stands or falls on its own merits. So I think that was a great thing to start off with, Anna, what you suggested as a hypothesis. Does anyone have any comments, whether reasons as to why Anna's hypothesis may be correct or reasons as to why it may be incorrect?
Well, actually, it would help me to have Anna repeat that I wasn't following it. I was listening very closely, but I couldn't quite follow what she was saying. And I think if it could be worded again, I would totally understand it better to even make a decision. So I just wasn't sure what her reason was why it was thinking it might be the original.
Anna got bumped off. Yeah.
Or you guys can repeat it.
Yeah, okay. I'll repeat basically what she was saying. So long as I understood her correctly, I think I did, but there's always a chance that I didn't. So if she comes back on, we can run it past her again, or we can ask her to repeat it in her own words. But essentially what I understood her hypothesis to be is, and like she said, she's not trying to nail it down, but she said that she'll take a shot at it. And so the hypothesis is that perhaps 1QS is the original reading, and that the Cave 4 manuscripts are actually a change from that. And the proposed evidence in favor of that hypothesis is that in 1QS, the instructions, or it's a rule that is for the men of the community. And so it is given to that group, and it's existent in that form as a rule for this community. And then later, a scribe came and said, okay, well now let us, rather than directing this content to the men of the community, let's write it as an instruction for the master to teach this already existing rule to the men of the law. So that's the hypothesis and the reason for it. All right, so do you think that you understand the idea more clearly now, Mom?
Yeah, a little bit better. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so would anyone like to offer any reasons as to why that might be a good hypothesis? Like, do you have any further evidence to strengthen that hypothesis? Or perhaps do you think that that's not actually good evidence for that hypothesis? Whatever it may be, would anyone like to voice their thoughts on that?
Well, I don't have the same reasons necessarily as Anna, but I do want to say that I think her hypothesis for 1QS being the more original could be a good one. I would hypothesize the same thing, but for slightly different reasons. One reason is because, as we've seen with some of the synoptic gospels, we know that Mark came first, and if I remember correctly, let me think. I may be getting a couple things mixed up. I'll rephrase this. There are some New Testament documents that we have in a language. Let's say it's in Greek, but it's in really poor Greek. And you can help me out. You'll know what I'm talking about here in a minute. When you have this one writing, it's in really bad grammar, really bad Greek, and then you have something, either the same book rewritten, but it's in really good grammar, or was it the Synoptic Gospels where one is using the other, but it was originally, the source was bad grammar, and maybe it has nothing to do with Greek or not, but just the grammar, and they cleaned up the grammar.
Right. So, yeah, what you're referring to is, you're getting it right with Matthew and Mark, and how Mark, when you look at the passages that overlap between Matthew and Mark, and it's clear that there's a literary relationship between them, and you're trying to discern which direction does this relationship go. Did Mark come first, or did Matthew come first? Well, it's recurrent throughout those parallels that the version in Mark will be more awkwardly worded, and the grammar isn't too smooth and everything. And then in Matthew, the same thing is very smooth. So the issue is, if the author of Mark had Matthew's gospel in front of him, and it's already so nice and smooth, why make it awkward? For what reason would that be?
Mm-hmm. When you're saying almost word for word the same thing anyway.
Exactly. Whereas the other direction makes more sense. Coming at it from the other direction, if the author of Matthew had the Gospel of Mark in front of him, well then, yeah, that makes sense that he's reading this and it's like, that's, I agree with what Mark is saying here, but it's awkwardly worded and the grammar isn't quite right, so I'm just going to make it better grammar and state the same thing more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a lot more sense as to why Matthew would change the content in Mark, even if it's ever so slightly, rather than doing it the other way around. So you're basically saying...
The reason I'm mentioning that example, and thank you for... I was like, I thought it was the synoptics, and then I was getting myself confused. Okay, anyway. Yeah, I see the Cave 4 manuscripts as being more concise and better flowing. And whereas this one in 1QS, I have the 1QS in front of me, whereas this one kind of repeats and says to cling to all his commandments according to his will. The according to his will is left off in Cave 4's. And it seems like it's not really needed. Like it seems pretty well implied that if someone's going to give a commandment, well, yeah, it's according to what they want. It's according to their will. So it's superfluous, not necessary. So that would be one reason. And then the other reason that I would have, and I don't think this is the same as what Anna was saying, but if it really is, then I just wasn't getting it. But the change from 1QS where it says, this is the rule for the men of the community who have freely pledged themselves to be converted, blah, 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 blah. It just sounds to me like the Cave 4 is writing things more clearly to be more, to be more clear. Because while I wouldn't say that it's not true that this is the rule for the men of the community, because it's to guide those in the community, seeing it as making more sense grammatically to have someone there to refer back to as with the pronoun his, right? So it just sounds to me like the Cave 4 documents are cleaning up the grammar of Cave 1.
And I think one of the things that you were saying, I'll try to express it and see if it's one of the aspects that you're getting at, is that in Cave 4 it seems to further specify kind of what it's getting at anyway in Cave 1. So it's like, yeah, it goes to the men of the community, but...
From who?
Yeah, from who? And perhaps it was originally supposed to be from the master anyway, but it's just not specified here, so avoid confusion and specify who it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's the gist of what I mean.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, you put it much better than me.
Well, it's interesting how, those are further proposed evidences in favor of the same hypothesis which Anna was putting forward. And since Anna unfortunately got bumped off, we won't further at this moment consider the validity of the evidence that she proposed in favor of her hypothesis. Instead, we'll focus on the things that Teresa just said. So does anyone have any comments in relation to the evidences that Teresa just suggested in favor of the hypothesis that 1QS actually came first?
I have to say I definitely agree with that because, and I'll give a couple of examples quickly of that. Let's say somebody's going to copy somebody's report, and they'll make maybe some slight changes. They're not for school. Let's say some kid at high school or something, and the person they're copying from is the better writer. They're going to get a better grade if they write better, and it will be understood more clearly. So that's done. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense for somebody to dumb it down when they have the perfect example or a better example in front of them. And then it also reminds me of language itself. We all know that there's slang words, and you just even go around our own country, there's almost different dialects, the way people pronounce things and say things and expressions. And then there's perfect English. Years ago, Teresa and I took part of a Spanish class, and that was brought out, good Spanish versus more slang and something like that. And then there was a camp meeting in Oregon years ago my sister told me about, where a lady was visiting her son or nephew, and she went to a tent meeting. This was years ago when the evangelistic meetings were all under tent. She couldn't understand a word of English, and so her son, the man, was picking up offering and stuff, and when he wasn't doing things, he would stand beside her. She was right there sitting at the inside aisle. And so here comes different speakers, and after this one particular speaker was through, he came back and stood beside her, and she turned to him and she said, "Didn't he speak beautiful Spanish?" And he looked at her and he said, "He wasn't speaking Spanish." Now, obviously that was a gift of God. She needed to hear that message, and so the speaking in tongues, worked that way for her. But she recognized beautiful Spanish versus what somebody that was unschooled might use, the grammar and the sentence structure and whatever. So that makes perfect sense in something like this that we're studying, is because it just wouldn't make sense if somebody was had the original that was written better in front of them, and then they would change it, or vice versa. So maybe I said more than I meant to, but one scribe could have been more educated than the other. Do you think?
Well, that's assuming that a different scribe wrote for QS and the one QS. I mean, it could have just been an improvement on one's own writing.
Although, as we noted last night, the differences in the date heavily lean in favor of the idea that it was a different scribe, because one is from the end of the 2nd century BC and one is at the end of the 1st century BC, so like 70 to 100 years apart. And people usually didn't live too long back then, and most of the corpses found at Qumran, they didn't live into their 70s and all of that. But that could be examined further, and paleographers probably already know this. You can identify if two different manuscripts are written by the same scribe or not by looking at the actual handwriting, because every scribe has different writing. So that
should be pretty easy to find out then, I would think.
Yeah, that should be pretty well, to a certain extent. And who knows, perhaps we could even look at it and notice if it's different enough to be noticeable, but it might look all the same to us because we don't.
Yeah, we're not trained in that.
We're not trained in that, but we could look it up and find what paleographers have to say on that, and even if manuscript B as in boy and manuscript D as in David were written by the same person or not. So far, everyone has expressed agreement with the hypothesis, and no one has expressed any disagreement with the evidences put forward. Does anyone have any disagreement or proposed challenges? Like, even if it's not like that you hold to the disagreement as like, no, they're wrong and here's why. But if you have something that you can think of that in some way challenges the validity of the proposed evidence for the hypothesis, it would be great to hear it. So does anyone have any such challenges?
Okay, I have one.
Excellent.
Okay, so 1QS is a lot longer than those from K4. Maybe whoever, okay, but then the other thing is, from last night's study, as you mentioned, it seems to imply from the dating that 1QS is probably early enough and 4QS is late enough that it probably wasn't written, like 1QS probably came first. Is that what I'm trying to remember?
Well, yeah, the actual document 1QS did come earlier than the documents from K4.
But K4 could be copying something
even earlier than 1QS, yeah.
Okay, so the point was just a different scribe copied it. Got it, okay.
Right.
Well, okay, so let's say then that K4 is a copy of a much earlier document that precedes 1QS. Well, so a proposed hypothesis that I don't necessarily hold to, but it's an option I can think of, is whoever wrote 1QS was just really wordy and wanted to add more to the document. Let's say the original document was much smaller, more like 4QS, because it doesn't have, 4QS starts with what 1QS has is column 5, right? So let's say the original actually didn't have the first 4 columns that we have in 1QS. So whoever wrote 1QS added those first 4 columns, and where it starts in column 5 and follows along with 4QS, and obviously I'm just referring to 4QS because it would represent potentially an earlier form of the community rule than we have in 1QS. Okay, so if there was an original form, much shorter, scribe comes along, rewrites it, adds 4 columns to the beginning, and just makes things a bit wordier, like adding according to his will when it's not necessary and different things like that. So, that's the best I can come up with as an alternative.
Okay, so there's a couple of different aspects. I'm glad at the end, because at first it sounded like it was just very broad in terms of the community rule and 1QS and the K4 manuscripts in general, but then you did end up actually narrowing it down to the particular phrase under consideration, and how even though it's superfluous, or it's at least seemingly superfluous, to have the phrase
according to his will,
that perhaps someone was just more wordy. And sure, it's possible. People could be more wordy, right? But still, it's kind of like, what would be the reasons? But so that's kind of an argument that could be made for the opposite position. What I'm really wanting to know, though, is does anyone have any challenges to the proposed evidences for the hypothesis that we've been discussing so far? That being that 1QS represents the original. And again, we're only talking within a narrow range right now. We're not trying to make final decisions as to the whole document or anything, but we're just looking at the material that is parallel to 1QS column 5 line 1. So this is the rule for the men of the community who devote themselves to turn away from all evil and hold fast to all which he has commanded as his will, or according to his will is another translation. That's how it is in Cave 1. In Cave 4, And it seems to be the case that it's in both manuscript B as in boy and in manuscript D as in David. However, manuscript B as in boy is missing part of it, so we can't say for sure. But at least for sure for manuscript D, it says in the same place. So it's the same material, but it has differences. So rather than wording it the way that 1QS does, as I just read, it says, instructions for the master concerning the men of the law who have dedicated themselves to withdraw from all evil and to hold fast to all which he has commanded. Okay, so Anna started out with the hypothesis that perhaps the 1QS reading is more original, and she gave a reason as to why. But, it looks like Anna's back. Welcome back, Anna.
I was gone.
Okay, there was an echo there. You want to try talking again?
I didn't know you realized I was gone, so I was like trying to figure out where we are. Okay, go ahead. I'm following now.
Okay, I'll just quickly update you on this. So, did you hear me explain the importance of us being happy and willing to challenge each other's hypotheses and to challenge our own hypotheses and all of that?
Yeah, in fact, I have a challenge for my own hypotheses, so when you finish.
Okay, cool. So I'm glad that you heard that. What happened after that is that, part of what I said is if anyone has any added evidence towards the hypothesis that you put forward, then let's hear that as well. And if anyone has any challenges to it, or reasons why the evidence that you put forward for your hypothesis maybe is not valid evidence, anything like that. So Teresa put forward added evidence for the same hypothesis that you suggested. So she pointed out that just like with Matthew and Mark, how it doesn't really make sense for the author of Mark to have written after Matthew and to have copied Matthew, and Matthew is just more clear, the grammar is better, and it's smoothed out more. It would be really weird for the author of Mark to have Matthew in front of him and to just make it more awkward and have worse grammar. Like, what reason would there be to do that when it's saying the same thing anyway? And so that doesn't really make sense. It makes far more sense for the author of Matthew to have the Gospel of Mark in front of him and to say, I agree with what Mark is saying, but it's kind of awkward in the wording in some places and some things need to be smoothed out, so I'm going to smooth it out but keep it pretty much the same. That makes far more sense than vice versa. So Teresa was saying, since the 4QS manuscripts have a smoother wording and it's more detailed and it's grammatically better, it makes more sense for 1QS to have come first, or the readings of 1QS to have come first, and then the reading that is found in 4QS seems to be a later cleanup, making it a bit smoother, having the grammar a bit better and a little bit more detailed, and removing kind of superfluous things. So at the end of this little clause in Cave 1, it says, which he has commanded according to his will. But in the Cave 4 manuscripts, it just says, which he has commanded. And she pointed out that saying according to his will kind of seems unnecessary because, of course, whatever someone's going to command is going to be according to their will. So it makes more sense to take that away since it seems unnecessary rather than to add it, because if it's already sufficient to say which he has commanded, why add according to his will? So those were added evidences that Teresa proposed in favor of the same hypothesis which you put forward originally. And so since you got bumped off, we decided, okay, let's not challenge Anna's hypothesis yet. Let's wait till she gets here. And basically, we've been discussing Teresa's added evidence. So if you have a challenge to your own hypothesis, please do put that forward.
Well, I'm making this with lack of information, right? But I was also thinking it could go the other way. My first hypothesis was that the rule came first, and then of course the one in cave 4 came second, because now there's a master that's given it to instruct it to the men of the community. But at the same time, if it does relate to the teacher of righteousness as the master, perhaps I was thinking cave 4 could have come first, and then after he died, this rule still was around, and now there's no master to give instructions, right? Perhaps not, perhaps, I'm not sure. And so then they took out the part about instructions for the master, and it's just whoever was giving it out, it just starts off with, this is the rule of the men of the community, blah, blah, blah. So, you get it?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I want to clarify the initial hypothesis that you put forward. Is it, like, both of them together, are you basically saying that it could be, as a hypothesis, that the two readings reflect two different historical situations, possible historical situations? So one possible historical progression would be that at first there's this rule that's for the men of the community, but there isn't really a master there to teach it, or at least it's not specified that a master should teach it. And then later, so that's saying that the 1QS came first, and then later 4QS was written, and there's now this functional role of master, and now the instruction is given to the master to teach this. And then the other proposed historical sequence would be to say that the master is really the teacher of righteousness, and that originally he was the one who was to teach this, but then he died, and then the command is for the master to do this, and this is instructions for the master, but since there's no master left, to say, okay, this is just the rule for the men of the community. So that's accurately representing both proposed hypotheses and the evidence for it as you suggested?
As always, it's 100% accurate, Trent. Yes.
Well, I don't think I'd say as always, because I didn't correctly, or at least not entirely, understand what you initially said before you got bumped off. I wasn't clear that you were saying that it was a basically proposed historical circumstance where maybe originally there was no master and then a master came along. But maybe I thought that you were just saying that it wasn't specified as to who was to do it, and then later they specified who was to do it. But very interesting. Anyway, your proposed hypotheses.
I'm totally open to that hypothesis. And, yeah, I see that it makes sense. Let's scrap the idea of cleaning up grammar. Sorry, we're getting some feedback. Did you want to make a comment, Mom?
Oh, well, I was kind of waiting, and then I forgot that I had it off mute. All I just wanted to say was I'm really glad that you all have been discussing this, because I wasn't even considering the fact that the master, after he died, they still carried on. I mean, that wasn't even in the picture yet for me. I just was assuming he was still alive. But, yeah, things would have to go on afterwards. So all this discussion is really, as far as that part goes, was really helping, and everything else is kind of coming together a little bit better, too.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, but in regard to what Anna's saying, her thought, and Anna, I don't know if you actually said this in one of your proposals or not. I'm getting, I'm not keeping them all straight anymore, but let's say that 4QS was the original, and it reads grammatically correct, but then the master dies and he's no longer there. And so in order for this to make sense contemporarily or whatever, then, well, let's drop the master. This is the rule for the men of the community. But then the rest of it still says, according to his commandments, and then they add according to his will. Well, that would explain why you have those pronouns, but no noun, no person to point back to with the pronoun.
Like if they're trying to change it kind of like as minimally as necessary.
Yeah.
But still changing it to match their new circumstance in which they find themselves with no teacher of righteousness left.
Right. I mean, I have a hard time picturing the rule of the community. Not that it can't be this way. I'm just saying I have a hard time picturing it coming about first and then a prophet. And by coming about first, I'm thinking not by inspiration. Now, I don't know if that was the implication Anna had in mind or not, but that was where my mind went when listening to the proposal.
In other words, in the first hypothesis where Cave 4 is the later one and 1QS is the earlier one, basically then you have no master in that proposed historical sequence. And so where did they then get this idea of, like, how did 1QS develop with the light and the darkness and all of these things, which are rooted in the teachings of the teacher of righteousness, and we know that from Thanksgiving hymns, and we know that according to the Damascus document and so on. How did they develop all of that without a teacher?
Mm-hmm.
And then later, they all of a sudden have the master. They have the instructor.
Right. Yeah, I don't picture that as the more likely. I mean, I'm open to it if evidence shows that, but...
So I just want to recap a little bit of this so far. So Anna's original hypothesis is one that she herself put a challenge to, and basically the challenge, as far as you expressed it, Anna, was to say that basically there's another hypothesis that explains the same information at least as well, to say that it also could be, that's one proposed historical circumstance, that there was no teacher, and then Cave 4 manuscripts came along because now there's the master to teach this rule which already existed. But you could just as well say that the reverse historical circumstance could have been the case, that perhaps the master is referring to the teacher of righteousness, and he was there at the beginning, and then he died, and then there was no master, and thus the Cave 1 manuscripts came about omitting the reference to the master because he's no longer there. So now it matches their historical circumstance. So you basically, so far as you expressed, said, hey, both of these can explain that difference, therefore it's not really evidence in favor of the first hypothesis. But what that would also mean is that it's not evidence in favor of the second hypothesis, because you could explain it either way. And so Teresa just took that thought and expressed it one step further to say that the first hypothesis actually makes less sense. Or I'll say that the evidence put forward in favor of the first hypothesis makes less sense than the reverse, because what that would require is a circumstance where 1QS is produced without the teacher of righteousness. And how then do you explain the content of 1QS without the teacher of righteousness? And actually, I'm going to take the thought one step further to point out that 1QS is not without a master. Remember how 1QS starts? Yeah, exactly. So, in other words, 1QS, it starts out talking about, let's see here.
The master shall teach the saints to live. Now that's supplied, though.
Exactly, that's supplied. So now, all of a sudden, 1QS, because it says, to the blank, or the blank, it's missing. So there's a fragmentary part that's missing at that section of...
That may be anachronistic.
1QS, exactly. So that may be a wrong conjecture. But it does show up in 1QS, column 3, line 13. It is for the master to instruct and teach all the sons of light concerning the nature of the sons of man.
Right.
So the master's there in 1QS. So whenever 1QS was put together, the master is there.
Right.
And there's also other places, just so you know, later on in 1QS where the master is present. So the question would be, if 1QS represents a period of time at which the master was no longer present, and the master was omitted from column 5, line 1, why not omit the reference to the master in the other places?
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem to be that the better historical circumstance then would be that the teacher of righteousness was there and then died, and basically even 1QS could be there first, but they just happened to not reference the teacher right away, even or the master, because they had referenced him in other places, and maybe the 1QS is more original, and later 4QS is just specifying further who it's supposed to be.
That would be back to my hypothesis of 4QS is later, and it's cleaning up the grammar.
Right.
Yeah.
So, does anyone, I'm noticing, oh, that's why we're not cut off. I was like, we should be cut off by now.
We got bumped out.
Yeah, we got bumped. Okay, I'll say, though, we have been on for an hour and a half, and maybe it's a good idea for us to bring the meeting to a close now, especially since this is detailed stuff. But I have to say, guys, I'm very happy with you guys have been critically thinking and putting forth hypotheses, and there have been a couple challenges to the proposed evidence for those hypotheses. So let's continue to contemplate this, and you guys can study it more throughout the week, and then next Friday night we'll get together and continue on this same point, because we haven't dealt with all of the hypotheses yet and the evidence put forward in favor of it. Let's just quickly, or I'll quickly recap the hypotheses on the table and the evidence put forward in favor of them and against them. And let's try and keep that in mind and continue to consider these different elements. So the initial hypotheses put forward, or the original hypothesis put forward by Anna, was that perhaps Cave 1QS represents the original reading, and that the Cave 4 manuscripts came later. And that could be explained by a historical sequence of events where first there was no master teaching this rule for the men of the community, but there's this rule that's there. And then later, a master arose, or someone who could be referred to as the master, and now he could be the one to teach it, and so later it was specified that this is an instruction for the master concerning the men of the law. Kind of another possibility along that same line of that hypothesis is that maybe a master was there all along and originally wrote that rule, but it was just not specified, and then later it was specified. So that's saying it's 1QS is first, the K4 documents represent a later reading. And then Anna also said, well, here is kind of a challenge to that hypothesis, and that's to say that maybe the K4 reading came first, and that the master referred to there is the teacher of righteousness, and that reading represents a time when the teacher of righteousness was alive, and then he died, and then later people rewrote it because there was no master. So you can't give the instructions to the master concerning the men of the law because the master no longer is alive. So let's just change it to our current historical circumstance without the master and just say this is the rule for the men of the community. So that's another proposed hypothesis, and I think that should still be on the table and everything, but kind of the challenge to that Teresa brought forward is to say, well, then we'd have to say that if we say that the first hypothesis is correct, it kind of fails to explain the production of 1QS itself, the production of the community rule, because then you have all these ideas coming about without a master, without an inspired teacher. And so that I added to that, well, even in 1QS, it mentions the master, even though not in this passage, so it doesn't seem to fit with the understanding of there being no master at the time when 1QS was produced. So in fact, we can cancel out that possibility. It's not that there was no master, and then later a master arose, and 1QS represents the period with no master, and then 4QS represents the period with a master. No, there was a master when 1QS was written. So that's something all to take into consideration. Now, Teresa put forward some evidence in favor of Anna's original hypothesis, that being that 1QS came first, and then the readings in 4QS are later changes. And the evidence that she put forward is to say that it seems more likely that a scribe would change the incomplete grammar of 1QS to the very complete and coherent grammar of 4QS. Because the K4 material makes sense. There, at the end of the clause that we're considering, it talks about which he commanded, and there is a he in the sentence to which that refers, that being the master. Whereas in 1QS, there's no one who the he is referring to that's clearly specified. So why go from something that's clear to something that's unclear? That doesn't really seem to make sense. So that's a proposed evidence for the hypothesis that 1QS preserves the earlier reading. Another evidence that Teresa mentioned in favor of that hypothesis is that in 1QS there seems to be unnecessary or superfluous things, particularly the phrase, according to his will. It says, which he commanded according to his will. Whereas in the K4 documents, it just says, which he commanded. Well, you could see the scribe of the K4 manuscripts leaving out according to his will, because obviously whatever someone commands is according to their will, so why have the part according to his will? That seems to make sense for someone to take that out. And it doesn't seem to make sense if the scribe who wrote 1QS had copies which said, which he commanded. I mean, why add according to his will? If you're going to specify something like that and yet make unspecific who the he even is, it doesn't really flow that well as to why you would make that change. So those are evidences put forward in favor of the idea that 1QS preserves the original reading. So I'm going to mention just a couple additional thoughts for you guys to consider, and then maybe I'll ask you guys next week what you have found in this regard. So here's one question. If you have two manuscripts where one has awkward grammar and one has better grammar, we know that sometimes it certainly makes more sense for the better grammar to come second because someone's cleaning it up. They're improving the grammar rather than making it worse grammar. So the question is, are there circumstances where someone might change something and make the grammar worse? And if so, can you guys think of examples and why that would be? So that's something to consider. And then another question that I want you guys to consider is it possible that 1QS could be preserving an earlier reading for 1QS column 5 line 1 where it's not specifying a master even though the master was there, but it's just not specifying, and still the Cave 4 manuscript could be specifying the master. In other words, it's still a change going in that direction, Anna's original hypothesis of 1QS being earlier and 4QS being later, but it's not reflective of a difference in historical circumstance. It's just reflective of a difference in how specific you're being.
That's the thought I had in mind.
Okay. So that's something to keep in mind and consider. So anyways, that's what's on our plate to consider for the week, and we'll come back next week. Right on, you guys. Thank you for participating in the experimental process of observation, hypothesis, and testing. This is it, guys. We're actually doing what we've been being trained to do, of employing experimental methods into studying these ancient texts.
And even though Anna's bumped off again, Mom's still on though, the comments that they both made, if they hadn't made them, this would have been a pretty flat study.
Oh, yeah. No, there have been excellent comments and excellent observations from the start. Like, this has been really good, guys. This is awesome. It's actually very encouraging to me to see people advancing in the critical thinking and analysis and all of that. It's awesome. So, Toda Eloheinu. Yeah, go ahead.
Could I squeeze in a quick thought? I know it's time to close, but is there any reason? Of course, we haven't. I have read the whole thing before a couple of times, but it's been a long time. So maybe the master is going to be mentioned further along in the copy that I have. But is there any reason, we can discuss this maybe next time, could not have been written over a period of years, starting out when the master was alive, then the master died, and that would change the wording or the necessity or lack of to mention his name. Because when we get into line 2, which we'll probably do next week, it's mentioning the sons of Zadok and the priests and something else, the authority of those men, and it doesn't say the teacher of righteousness or the master or anything like that. So I just wanted to throw that out. I would really like to know if that's possible, that this document could have been written over a period of time and then finished years after the master died. That's all.
Okay, so let's keep that in mind as well as we study this, and we'll consider that more next week. is it possible that 1QS is a compilation of several different manuscripts, and that maybe some part of it came from the time when the Teacher of Righteousness was alive, but maybe some part of it, maybe 1QS column 5 does reflect a time after the Teacher of Righteousness was dead, but it would just happen to be compiled with other documents that were making reference to the Teacher of Righteousness. And so that gets into the whole thing of composition history, and that's all very important to consider. So I'm glad that you mentioned that possibility as well.
Kind of makes my head spin, actually.
Well, this is good. We'll get our heads spinning so much that we'll screw them on straight. Okay, wonderful. So let's thank our Heavenly Family. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for this wonderful privilege to be able to study this together. And I thank you for settling the branch candidates into your ways of really considering the evidence and to examining things, and not to just assume that it's a certain way, but to actually dive in and ask, make the observations and put forward the hypotheses and test them. Thank you for this experimental way of obtaining knowledge, really the only way. Thank you so much. Please guide us. Help us to really learn the methods and the conclusions so that we can test this rightly. Thank you so, so very much. Toda Eloheinu. Guide us through the week as we study, and bless each person here. Thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Lila Tov, love you all very much.
Love you too.
Lila Tov.